Marine Sergeant tested her combat skills until she disarmed him in 3 seconds, so this is what the Corps is sending me now, Colonel Marcus Holt said, dropping the words into the middle of the briefing room like something he'd already decided to throw away. Tell me, sweetheart, what exactly do you do here? Hold the clipboard? Fetch coffee for the real soldiers? The question cuts through the air-conditioned silence of Camp Lejeune's Tier 1 training center like a blade scraping metal. 43 people stood in that room. Instructors with clipboards, drill sergeants with crossed arms, 6 fresh-minted captains still learning where to look when a colonel spoke, maintenance techs who'd paused mid-task, a wrench still turning in one man's hand, because something in the room had shifted its weight, and nobody quite knew in which direction. Colonel Marcus Holt stood at the front of it all, with his chest ribbons catching the fluorescent light, and his arms crossed like he owned not just this base, but the entire eastern seaboard. 22 years of rank insignia. Distinguished Service Medal. Legion of Merit, with 2 oak leaf clusters. His shadow, when he stepped closer to her workstation, fell across the surface of her laptop, and the 2 halves of the disassembled M110 sniper rifle she had been cleaning with the quiet, practiced efficiency of someone doing arithmetic. She did not look up. The woman at the workstation was 31 years old, 5'4" in regulation boots, hair pulled into a bun so precise it looked stenciled. Civilian contractor badge clipped to the breast pocket of a plain olive uniform, no rank insignia, no unit patch, no name tag that matched anything in his database. Her hands moved over the rifle components with a grip that was, and this was the detail, that Sergeant Major Raymond Okafor, standing in the doorway with his second cup of coffee gone cold, filed immediately into a category he'd been building for the past 40 minutes. Not standard. Not anything from a manual. The angle of her left wrist when she rotated the bolt carrier. The finger spacing. The speed. Rangemaster Ellis, who had spent 31 years breaking down weapons in the dark, had that grip. One other person Okafor knew had that grip, and that person was classified above his clearance level and officially dead. She still had not looked up. I asked you a question, miss. Holt stepped closer. His boot heels announced each step. Or are the Marine Corps contractor girls too busy with their little craft projects to answer a full colonel? She set down the barrel extension. She looked up. Her eyes were the particular gray of a sky that has seen too many things and given up on being surprised by any of them. Higher than yours, sir, she said. You just don't know it yet. Then she picked up the barrel extension and resumed her work. In the doorway, Sergeant Major Raymond Okafor, 61 years old, 33 years of service, raised his coffee cup slowly to his mouth. His pen stopped moving across the inspection checklist. It did not move again for a long time. Marcus Holt was not a man who received answers he hadn't approved in advance. He processed this one for 3 seconds, the calculation visible behind his eyes, and then he smiled. The kind of smile that invites everyone else in the room to join in. Several of them did. By 1100, the story had traveled through every informal channel Camp Lejeune had to offer. By mess call it had embellishments. She'd called him sir with audible contempt. She'd laughed. She'd kept cleaning the gun like he wasn't worth stopping for. Contractor girl mouthed off to Holt. Holt let her. The majority vote, wildly mistaken about her own importance. She ate lunch alone at a corner table. She listened the way a sonar system listens, passively, completely, cataloging everything. Okafor, watching from 3 tables over, recognized this. Every piece he'd collected since Neuro 800 fitted a picture he was building, and the picture made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, not concern. Recognition, he had seen this shape before. The way someone moves when they have spent years ensuring nobody could see what they were actually doing. At 1300, she input the monthly access authentication code for the secure systems room. The terminal logged 9.4 seconds. Okafor, who had reviewed the log on a whim while conducting an unscheduled infrastructure check, sat very still in front of that number. Most operators, good operators, trained operators, averaged 4 to 5 minutes with that code sequence. Some of the faster ones got it down to 90 seconds. He had never seen 9.4 seconds. Not once. Not in 33 years. Not standard. Not close. She hadn't looked at the keypad when she typed it. He cross-referenced the security log a second time. Then a third. The timestamp did not change. He closed the file and walked to the window and looked out at the training yard and thought about the kind of person who carries a code like that in muscle memory so thoroughly it bypasses cognition entirely. The kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from a manual. He controlled his own breathing, slow and deliberate, and was not fully aware he was doing it. At 1400, during a joint unit close quarters drill in the West Training Bay, her assigned evaluation role was to observe and document. She stood at the edge of the mat with a clipboard. At some point, Okafor wasn't sure exactly when. She had apparently made some comment to one of the drill instructors about the third team's entry point geometry. She had said it quietly. The drill instructor had dismissed it. 15 minutes later, the third team's entry point failed in the exact manner she had described, and their instructor spent 12 minutes reconfiguring the approach while she stood and documented, and did not once say anything that resembled "I told you so." She knew. She had always known. She simply hadn't been asked. At 15:30, the sleeve of her uniform rode up when she reached for a water bottle. The scar was there for approximately 3 seconds before the fabric fell back into place. Not surgical, not clean. The kind of irregular, puckered tissue that comes from shrapnel, from proximity to an explosion that should have been fatal, but wasn't. From something that happened far away from any room that issued after-action reports with her name on them. Okafor looked at the scar for those 3 seconds. Then he looked at her face. She was already looking somewhere else entirely, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. She controlled her breathing. 4 in, hold 4. 4 out, hold 4. Even here, even now, Okafor set his coffee down and picked up his pen. He did not add anything to the checklist. At 14:45, the afternoon brought a different kind of pressure. Colonel Holt reappeared with 2 captains flanking him. He had spent the day running her name through every database his clearance allowed. He'd found her contractor ID and a sparse employment record that resolved to a unit assignment that, when he called the contact number, put him on hold for 11 minutes, then disconnected. Not a good sign. Not for him. "Contractor Cross," he said. She looked up. Unhurried, she set down a printed schematic for the base's secondary communications infrastructure. The 4th she had reviewed that day, each marked with pencil notations in a shorthand none of the captains recognized. "I've been reviewing your authorization documentation. There appear to be discrepancies." She looked at the document. She looked back at him. "No, there aren't. That's a matter for security to determine. Then let security determine it." She picked the schematic back up. "I'll be here." His boots crunched on the hard floor as he turned and walked. He thought, "I know what you are." At 16:15, Colonel Holt escalated from informal to official. The order came through proper channels. Contractor ID 7742 Alpha was to report to the base security office for credential verification. The order cited a discrepancy in her clearance documentation. It cited a gap in her personnel file. It cited a procedural concern. It was theater. Okafor recognized theater. He had performed enough of it in his career to know the props and the staging. What Holt actually wanted was to formalize the humiliation he had started that morning, to make her small in an official capacity, with paperwork and witnesses, and a record that would follow her into whatever room she tried to enter next. What he did not understand, what he could not see from where he was standing, was that every official action he had taken since 0845 that morning had been a mechanism. His investigation was her trigger. His obstruction was her evidence. He was building her case for her with every move he made. And he was doing it because he thought he was the one holding the weapon. She presented herself at the security office at 16:30 on the hour. Staff Sergeant William Reyes, 26 years old, 2 years of base security experience. A man who had never seen a credential challenge that involved quite this level of personal interest from a full colonel, ran the interview. Colonel Holt observed from the inner office doorway with his arms crossed like he owned not just this base, but the entire eastern seaboard. "State your name and contractor ID." She gave them. Her voice was even. Unhurried. "Purpose of presence at Camp Lejeune? Systems evaluation." "Which systems?" "Classified above your clearance level, Staff Sergeant." Reyes blinked. Holt's jaw tightened. "Who authorized your presence here?" "The authorization code is in my documentation. I gave it to you at the desk." "We're having difficulty verifying, I know." Reyes stopped. "Excuse me? You're having difficulty verifying it because the authorization exists in a system you don't have access to." She said it the way someone explains the weather. Factual, indifferent to whether or not the information is welcome. "I'd suggest contacting the Defense Personnel Security Research Center. Or you could wait. The verification will come through automatically in approximately 90 minutes. We'll be confiscating your credentials in the meantime." She nodded. She placed her badge on the desk. She placed her ID card beside it. She breathed. 4 counts in, hold 4. 4 out, hold 4. They did not take her watch. She had planned for this. She had planned for this, the detail she allowed herself to observe, alone in that plain olive uniform, sitting across from a staff sergeant who was doing his job while a colonel tried to do something else entirely, exactly 3 months ago. They put her in a holding room at 1700. The room was 8 feet by 9. Concrete walls painted an institutional beige that had yellowed toward the color of old teeth. A metal bench along one wall, aluminum, bolted to the floor. The kind of fixture designed to be uncomfortable without being cruel. The kind of thing that told you exactly what this room thought of you. A window near the ceiling, 6 inches of it, that showed only a strip of sky going slowly orange at the edges. The smell of disinfectant failing to cover something older, some sediment of anxiety and waiting that had accumulated in this room over years of people sitting exactly where she was sitting now. The door was heavy. The lock was electronic. She had noted the model when they brought her in. AMSEC keypad, 2-second lockout on failed entries. Not relevant. She had no intention of leaving through the door. She sat on the metal bench. She set her hands flat on her thighs. She breathed. This is the near-fail moment. The point where anyone watching from the outside would think she's finished. Caught. Game over. Except games have rules, and she was about to show them they'd been playing the wrong game entirely. Her watch read 1703. She had worn the watch through 2 combat deployments and 1 operation that had no official designation. It was a field-grade chronograph, nothing that drew attention, nothing that suggested anything beyond functional. It had a secondary display no one had noticed, because no one had looked for it. She had planned for this. For a room, for a lock, for confiscated credentials, for a colonel who would use every tool of institutional authority he possessed. She had planned for all of it 93 days ago, on a Tuesday, in a room at the Pentagon that did not appear in any directory, sitting across a table from a general who had told her, "If we're right about Holt, he will do this. He will not be able to stop himself." She had said, "I know. Let him." In 22 minutes, she would miss a mandatory check-in with a handler whose name appeared on no document below TSSI clearance. The missed check-in would trigger a welfare protocol. The protocol was automatic. It did not require her to be conscious, cooperative, or free. It required only that the check-in not happen. In 58 minutes, a secondary verification code she had logged into the DPS ARC system 93 days ago would activate. The code would pull 3 documents out of a classified archive and route them to the desks of 4 specific individuals. She had chosen those 4 individuals very carefully. 2 of them were currently on base. One of them was Major General Patricia Vance, who was, even at this moment, on a flight that had departed Quantico at 14:10. In approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes, Colonel Marcus Holt was going to learn the difference between rank and authority, between the uniform you wore and the uniform that wore you, between the person who sits at the head of a table and the person who built the table and knows exactly which joints will fail under pressure. She looked at the strip of orange sky through the ceiling window. She thought about 6 Marines whose names she had memorized from a file she was not supposed to have accessed. Staff Sergeant Daniel Quirk, 34, Pensacola. Corporal James Arrigo, 27, Providence. Sergeant Toms Mendoza, 31, El Paso. 3 others. 6 people whose families had been told an operational loss and given no further information for 7 years. She had their names memorized in the order they were listed in the sealed file. She recited them the way some people count sheep. She had been reciting them for 3 weeks. She breathed. 4 in, hold 4, 4 out, hold 4. She waited. The first crack came at 17:24. Sergeant Major Raymond Okafor walked into the base security office at a pace that was not running, but was not far from it. He went directly to the duty officer, a lieutenant named Park, who had been in charge of the security office for 3 weeks, and who would remember this particular evening for the rest of his career. "I'd be extremely careful about the woman you have in holding room 3, Okafor said, quietly enough that it wasn't a scene, firmly enough that it was. Lieutenant Park looked at him. "I'm not saying I know who she is," Okafor continued, "because if I knew who she was, I couldn't tell you. I'm saying I've served 33 years, and I have seen certain kinds of people in certain kinds of situations. And this is not a situation I would want my name attached to when the paperwork resolves." He picked up his coffee. "That's all. Just a word." Colonel Holt, standing in the doorway of the duty officer's inner office, heard this. His jaw tightened. Then his face cycled through something, just for a heartbeat, and then it was gone. "Stand down, Sergeant Major," he said. "This is a credentials matter. It's nearly resolved." Okafor looked at him. "Yes, sir," he said. He said it the way men say "yes, sir" when they mean something completely different. Then he walked to a chair in the corner of the security office and sat down. He didn't leave. He took out his inspection checklist. He held his pen over it. He did not write anything. At 17:25, the base perimeter security notification system flagged an approaching vehicle convoy. Not base transport. Not standard. The convoy consisted of 3 black Chevy Suburbans moving in formation, which was the kind of appearance that said this is official business at the highest level, and the business has nothing to do with whatever you thought was happening here. At 17:26, the convoy stopped outside the base security building. The first figure out of the lead vehicle was a woman in service dress with 2 stars on her collar. Major General Patricia Vance, Commanding General, Marine Forces Special Operations Command. She walked the way someone walks when they are not at a social visit. Purpose in the shoulders, economy in the stride. Behind her came a man in a dark suit with a lanyard that bore a seal Colonel Holt recognized only because he had once seen it in a briefing he'd been told to forget. Then, a second woman in service dress, 3 stars. A lieutenant general who had not been on any schedule Holt had access to. Holt went pale. Not frightened. Not yet. His face did the calculation one more time. The same calculation he'd been running since that morning, and arrived at a new number, and the new number was wrong in a direction he hadn't anticipated. "Where is she?" said Major General Vance. Not a question. A coordinate. Lieutenant Parks said, "Holding room 3. Ma'am, release her." Holding room 3 opened at 17:31. She stood up from the metal bench. She had not been pacing. She was not disheveled. She looked. Okafor thought from the doorway, like a woman who had spent the last 28 minutes having a perfectly acceptable evening. She walked out of the room and directly to the main security office. And when she reached the center of it, she stopped. Major General Vance looked at her. The look was not surprise. It was not relief. It was the particular look of a commanding officer who had spent 4 days on an aircraft because a protocol flagged in a system she had personal oversight of, and who had arrived at the outcome she had expected, but whose stomach had not unclenched until this exact moment. "You missed your check-in," the general said. "Yes, ma'am. I was detained." "I know." The general's eyes moved to Colonel Holt. "I am aware. Everything in the room shifted its weight again, but this time the direction was very clear. Holt said, "General, with respect, this woman is a civilian contractor whose credentials failed basic verification." "We followed standard protocol, Colonel Holt." The lieutenant general stepped forward. Her voice was the kind of quiet that makes people check exits. It was not raised. It was not clipped. It had the specific texture of a sound that knows it doesn't need to be loud because the room will go quiet regardless. "I am going to suggest, very strongly, that you stop speaking." Holt stopped. Sergeant Major Okafor, standing in the doorway, watched a colonel who had spent 22 years building an architectural certainty about how rooms and rank worked receive the information, in real time, that he had built it on the wrong foundation. The room waited. Lieutenant Park, the duty officer, 3 weeks in the job, the youngest person in the room. A man who had that morning believed this would be an average Tuesday, stood behind his desk with his hands flat on the surface, and his face wearing an expression that was trying very hard to be professionally neutral and achieving only approximately 70% of that goal. 43 people in a room. 43 people who had laughed at her, or stood by while others laughed, or done nothing, which was its own kind of decision. 43 people now standing in a silence that had weight and texture, and a very specific direction. Then the man in the dark suit set a file on the duty officer's desk. He opened it. Inside were 3 documents. The top one bore a classification header that Colonel Holt had seen precisely once in his career, in a room he'd had to sign 14 separate non-disclosures to enter. He recognized the header the way you recognize something you've been hoping not to see again. Classification, to sigh, compartmented, access restricted. The second document was a personnel record. Her personnel record, not the contractor file that had failed verification, not the sparse employment history he'd found in the database. The real one. He could not read it from where he was standing, but he could see the thickness of it, the number of tabbed sections, the classification markers on every visible edge. The third document was a warrant. Holt looked at the warrant for 3 seconds. His blood ran cold, the kind of cold that starts in the sternum and moves outward. He looked at the warrant and understood, with the precision of a man whose career had been built on reading official documents, exactly what it authorized and exactly whose name was on the subject line. He looked at the woman standing in the center of the room in a plain olive uniform with a contractor badge. She tilted her head slightly, almost imperceptibly. She was watching him, understand. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The 43 people in that room had all arrived here by different paths, some through professional obligation, some because they'd been there when it started and had developed a personal investment in how it ended, and in this moment, they were all in exactly the same place, waiting, without fully understanding why, for whatever came next. She let them wait. Sergeant Major Okafor, standing in the doorway with his inspection checklist forgotten in his left hand, watched her face. He had been cataloging it since 0800. Every expression she had produced today, or rather every absence of expression, every controlled stillness that stood in the place where a reaction would have been, had given him one more piece of the picture he was building. The picture was almost complete now. He thought about the grip on the M110 barrel, the authentication code in 9.4 seconds, the scar on her forearm, the posture under pressure, exactly regulation, the way it gets drilled until muscle memory overrides panic. The way she had stood in that corridor that morning while Holt performed his contempt for an audience of 43 people, and had produced nothing. No flinch, no anger, no amusement, no hurt, just absolute physical stillness, like a calm that has nothing to do with peace and everything to do with a particular kind of training that most people in uniform would not recognize, because most people in uniform had not been where she had been. He had been. Once. A long time ago. He had stood in a room very much like this one and watched a person very much like her receive exactly this kind of treatment. Dismissal built on appearances, authority performing for an audience, and he had said nothing. He had filed it away. He had told himself it was above his pay grade. He had spent the next 20 years occasionally wishing he hadn't. He was not going to make that calculation again. So he had said what he had said to Lieutenant Park. I'd be very careful about this one. Not an order. Not a revelation. Just the kind of word a man with 33 years deposits quietly in a room and then leaves alone to do its work. He had done it knowing it probably wouldn't stop anything. He had done it anyway, because some actions are not about outcome. Some actions are about being, finally, the kind of man who doesn't watch things happen and file them away. He looked at her now, standing in the center of the security office, in a plain olive uniform with no rank insignia. The generals behind her. The warrant on the desk. The entire calculus of the day arrived at this exact coordinate. She met his eyes for approximately 1 second. Something passed between them. Not communication. Not quite recognition. Just the specific silence between two people who understand the same thing, arrived at by different roads. Then she looked at Holt. She controlled her breathing. 4 in. Hold 4. 4 out. Hold 4. Then she reached to the inside hem of her left sleeve and pushed it up 6 inches, and the room saw the tattoo. It was not large. It was precise, heraldic in its geometry. a bird with wings angular and exact. A number beneath it that was not a number most people in this room had ever seen outside classified context. A designation rendered in ink the same dark blue-black as a night sky over water. It was the kind of mark that got put on certain people in certain units by a process that was not documented, by a command that did not officially exist. Staff Sergeant Reyes made a sound he would later be unable to describe. Something involuntary. Someone behind him set a tablet down on a desk, and the clatter echoed through the stunned air of the room like a gunshot. The act hummed. A boot scuffed tile. A chair scraped concrete somewhere down the hall. The silence after these small sounds was total. The silence had weight. It had texture. It pressed against the walls of the security office and held there. Sergeant Major Raymond Okafor, 61 years old, 33 years of service. A man who had cataloged every piece of this picture since 0800 with the patient precision of someone who already knew what the finished image would show, felt his chest do something he could not have put language to. It was the specific internal architecture of a belief confirmed. Of a 33-year career, suddenly producing one moment that organized everything before it into coherence. He had known. He had known since the grip on the M110 barrel, since the authentication code, since the scar. He had known, and he had waited. And now here it was, standing in the center of a base security office in a plain olive uniform, absolutely still, absolutely unafraid. Major General Vance turned to the room. "For the record," she said, "and before anyone in this room takes another action or says another word, the individual you have detained and whose credentials you have confiscated is Master Gunnery Sergeant Elara Cross. Call Sign Wraith, currently assigned to a classified Special Operations Task Force under direct Pentagon authorization. Her operational record includes 4 classified deployments, 2 of which exist in no file accessible below TS/Psi compartmented clearance. She holds the distinction of being the only operator in the task force's 12-year history to have completed a solo extraction from denied territory. Her mission, which began on this base 3 weeks ago, relates to an active internal security investigation at the highest classification level. The subject of that investigation is currently in this building." The general's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Every person in this room, including myself, answers to her operational authority within the scope of that mission. The first salute came from the Lieutenant General. She raised her hand in the precise, slow way of full formal military respect, the hand moving from the shoulder, the wrist angle exact, the palm edge aligned, and held it. Major General Vance followed. Then the man in the dark suit, who turned out to have a second set of credentials that explained the seal on his lanyard. Then one of the captains. Then another. Then Staff Sergeant Reyes, who had run the credential challenge, whose face had gone through surprise and denial and arrived somewhere that looked like a person reassessing the past 8 hours from a completely different elevation. Then the maintenance tech, who had still had the wrench in his hand that morning. The room went up like a tide. 41 people. Colonel Marcus Holt stood in the doorway of the duty officer's office and did not move. His face cycled through surprise, denial, and something that settled eventually into genuine fear. Not of her, exactly, of the specific arithmetic of what he had done and what it now meant. He raised his hand, finally, when every other hand in the room was already up. He raised it the way a man raises his hand when he has no remaining options. It was worse than not raising it. Everyone present understood this. Elara Cross received the salute without gesture, without expression. She acknowledged it with a single nod, the way a senior officer acknowledges a briefing that has delivered expected information. Then she turned to the duty officer's desk and picked up her contractor badge and her ID card and placed them back in her pocket. She did not pick up the documents. She didn't need them. The room had seen them. The investigation, she said to the general and to the room and to no one in particular, is ongoing. The formal charges were filed at 1900 that evening. They were filed quietly, without theater, in the specific language of the Uniform Code of Military Justice: obstruction of a classified federal investigation, interference with a covert operative, abuse of command authority, and 3 additional charges whose precise wording was classified above the level of anyone in the security office. The investigators who processed the filing were not from the base. They were from a federal division whose letterhead most people in uniform never had cause to see, and they moved through their task with the efficient, unhurried manner of people who have done this many times and found nothing in it that surprised them. There was also a secondary matter. The investigation she had been running for 3 weeks had produced, among other documentation, a series of financial records, a set of encrypted communications logged to an anonymous server in Bahrain, and a personnel file with 3 pages that Colonel Holt had personally authorized to be sealed 7 years ago. The personnel file belonged to a Marine reconnaissance unit. All 6 members were listed as killed in action during an operation that had never formally existed. The encrypted communications suggested the operation had not failed due to enemy contact. It had failed because someone with base-level authority had sold the unit's route to a contact in a foreign intelligence network for a sum that appeared in a numbered account in the Cayman Islands, and that account had been receiving deposits on a quarterly schedule for the past 7 years. The 2 individuals from the 3rd Suburban escorted Colonel Holt from the security building at 1853. He walked in the particular silence of a man who has understood, very recently and very completely, that the ground he thought he was standing on had never been there. His chest ribbons caught the floodlights in the parking area. Distinguished Service Medal. Legion of Merit. 2 oak leaf clusters. He went without a scene. There was no scene left to perform for. His audience had rearranged itself. Sergeant Major Raymond Okafor watched him go from the doorway of the security office. He watched until the SUVs left the base perimeter and the lights disappeared down the access road. Then he turned and looked at the room. At 41 people who were still in various stages of processing the last 3 hours. At the duty officer's desk, where the classified documents had been, now cleared and ordinary again, he looked at the empty space in the center of the room where she had stood. Then he walked to a chair, sat down, picked up his inspection checklist, and, for the first time since 0800 that morning, wrote something on it. He wrote, "She was exactly what I thought." He set the pen down. He looked at the strip of sky visible through the window. He thought about 6 Marines whose deaths had been filed and forgotten and were now, perhaps, about to be explained. Not perfect, he said quietly to no one. Never perfect. But better. At 21:15, Alara Cross was alone. She stood on a concrete walkway at the east edge of the base, where the land fell away slightly, and the Carolina sky opened up over the tree line. 21:15. The sky at this hour was the particular purple-black of a night that hadn't quite finished becoming itself. A last memory of orange and deep blue along the western horizon, where the sun had recently stopped arguing. Stars were beginning to negotiate their terms. She controls her breathing. 4 in, hold 4. 4 out, hold 4. They had tested her rank. They had forgotten she outranked their corruption. The mission wasn't finished. It was never finished. Holt had been the visible piece, the performance, the theater. The man who thought his star count was an argument. The investigation had started because of what Holt knew, what he'd been paid to look away from, what he'd filed and refiled and buried in the particular administrative sediment where things went when someone needed them to disappear. 3 names on the task force's list were resolved. 1 warrant was outstanding. 1 personnel file flagged for judicial review. 1 name was still a blank space. She had a surveillance photograph taken from a rooftop in Amman 16 months ago, a figure at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by a satellite dish. Regulation posture. Someone who knew how to stand in a way that didn't read as military unless you already knew. She'd stared at that photograph 100 times. The shoulder angle, the weight distribution. She knew how to wait. Justice isn't loud. It's patient. Somewhere on the base, a light was still on in a briefing room. Somewhere in a classified server, a protocol she had not yet triggered was waiting for her authorization. Tomorrow's operation had a 0400 briefing time and 3 variables she hadn't fully mapped. She checked her watch. 21:18. Tomorrow brings new ghosts to hunt. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to MVP Stories for more.